think I had taken a break during my 9 and 10 years, but I thought of 2 or 3 things in the younger years that I want to go back and mention. The first is when I was 3 or 4 years old, I remember riding the interurban to Dallas for the Dallas Fair. My parents and I took me there for the day. I don't remember anything about the fair, but I remember that interurban. It was like a one-car train that ran between Cleveland and Dallas, and it had no steam engine, and I have no idea how it was powered. It was, I guess, something like a streetcar, but I don't remember it having that apparatus that operates streetcars. So I have no idea how it was powered. But we rode the interurban to Dallas, and I thought that was a great experience riding that train car to Dallas and getting to look out the window all the way and see all the farms. Now, the next thing that was about that age group of 3 and 4 was our Victrola. Somebody gave my parents a Victrola. It was a tall one in a nice cabinet with a place underneath for storing records. And we had only one record, which the people who gave us the Victrola gave the record. And I would stand on a stool to get up and reach where the record player was. And, well, I forgot. First, I had to roll. There was a handle on the side, and you had to roll it round and round and round to wind up the Victrola because it was not electric. So I would stand there and roll that thing for as long as I could. And then I would stand on the stool and put the little needle over on the record. And that one record was a march. And I thought that march was wonderful with the drums and the horns and all, and I could just imagine what it looked like. And I remember I would go in the kitchen and get a cake pan and a big spoon, and then I would close the doors to the dining room, and I would start that Victrola, and I would play that record and march around the dining table, round and round. That was my parade. And I loved hearing that record and marching to it and imagining that I was in a big parade. Oh, I loved that. Now, the other side of the record was just some romantic song, and I didn't care about that. But I loved that record of the march. We just had a Victrola for a few years, and then since nobody was using it except me, and my parents only had that one record, They gave the Victrola to Uncle Burr and Grandmother Davis because they could enjoy it since they didn't have any electricity. And Mother's sisters donated several other records for them to play. And somebody, I think it was Granddad Lusk, took the Victrola out. I can't remember if he had a pickup that early or they just put it in his car. But anyway, he got that Victrola out there and gave it to them, and they set it up in the front of their front room, their little sitting room. And so I didn't get to march to that band any longer, but I had enough other things to do. Then I remember when I was about 5, and I was still going to prayer meetings with my daddy, but I had gotten to where I was big enough that I didn't go to sleep in his lap anymore. I sat there beside him and I listened to the prayers. And I thought, I can hardly wait till I'm big enough to say a prayer like the others are doing. And I just started thinking about what I could say. And when I was 5 years old, sure enough, I stood up next to my daddy, and after he said his prayer, I said my prayer. Very short, but I said it out loud. And that was the first time I prayed out loud. And I was 5 years old. So I just was remembering those things when I was younger. Then now I want to go back to where I had left off before, during the period when I was 9 and 10 years old. Now, I told about starting to camp then and other things, but one of the big things when I was 9 was getting my bicycle. When I was 9 years old, my parents took me down on my birthday to the Dixon store and took me up into the toy department and told me to pick out a bicycle, that I could have any of the bicycles that I wanted. Oh, that was wonderful. But you know what I chose? There was no doubt about it in my mind. I chose a boy's bicycle. A boy's bicycle that had bars across the front to separate it. Anybody that rode it had to be wearing pants because it's separated there. So I chose this boy's bicycle. It was a light blue bicycle, and oh, how I loved that. And it meant that I could ride down to see Jeanette or my other friends. Didn't have to have my mother take me. And I could ride for several blocks all around that part of town. And I loved doing that. And I especially loved the 4th of July because I was very patriotic and I always celebrated every holiday. So on the 4th of July, I had my mother get crepe paper for me red, white, and blue, and I decorated my bicycle like I had seen a picture in the paper of a bicycle in a parade. And I decorated my bicycle, and I decorated Ann's tricycle, and decorated our red wagon. And then I would tie them all together, tie her tricycle and that wagon to my bicycle, and ride down the street in a parade. We had our own parade, and oh, how I loved that, and I was so proud. And you know, we didn't have hardly any traffic, so it was perfectly safe for me to be riding down the middle of the street, pulling on a bicycle, pulling a tricycle and a wagon. Ann would ride on her tricycle. Sometimes we would have another little friend riding in the wagon. And oh, I loved that. And then there were the fireworks. I loved fireworks. And I love hearing firecrackers and seeing fireworks going up in the air. And of course, the first thing that young children got was sparklers. And I remember having fun with sparklers. But I wanted more than that. And I wanted so much to be able to shoot firecrackers by myself. And I kept begging my daddy to let me do that. And finally he found some small firecrackers. I think they were about half an inch long. And they were in a tied up together with about 20 of them in a package. And he gave those to me. And I got to sit down on our front sidewalk. And I had a thing to light them with that you could strike a match to it and get it started, and then it would burn. And that's what was used to light fireworks with. And so I would sit there and shoot those firecrackers. And I thought I was being just about as grown up as the boys in the neighborhood that were shooting big firecrackers. So I loved that. And then at night, Daddy would take me down to the end of the street and take several of the neighborhood boys with us. And my daddy would have bought a bunch of fireworks. And we would stay down there shooting those fireworks up in the air. And I can remember how I wanted so much to hold one of those when it was going off. And I couldn't do it for a long time. And finally, Daddy let me hold a Roman candle. He stood right beside me, but he let me hold that Roman candle. And I still remember the thrill of holding it as it went up in the air and all these sparks flew. I wanted to hold some other things, but I was never allowed to do anything else but the Roman candle. So those were the fireworks I loved. 4th of July was a big occasion in our family. Then I remember when I was about 9, was about the time of some Sunday school parties. Now, as I may have mentioned before, our church was one of the centers of our life. And we had church suppers regularly and would have programs. And usually I didn't understand the program, but I loved going to those church suppers. And that was such fun sitting at a long table with all that food and just hearing all these people talking. I loved doing that. And then the Sunday school teachers gave parties for the members of the class. And I can remember especially two parties that my teacher, Mrs. Wansley, gave us when I was about 9 and 10 years old. One of them was a slumber party, and we all brought some quilts. Of course, we didn't have sleeping bags in those days. We brought some quilts and a pillow from home, and they had a large house with a L-shaped porch around it. And on the long side of the porch, we would spread out our quilts, and that's where we would sleep. And that was so much fun. Of course, we didn't really sleep, but I mean, that's where we would go to bed. And Mrs. Wansley's daughter was in high school, and she played the saxophone in the high school band. And she would bring out her saxophone and play for us. And oh, that was fun. It made me think, oh, I wish I could play a saxophone when I get big. Anyway, we just had such a good time together. And then about 4 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Wansley called the bakery. There was a bakery in Cleburne where the bread was baked that was sold in the grocery stores in that area. So they baked a lot of bread. And Mrs. Wansley already had this arranged with them. But she called about 4 and asked if the bread was ready. And they said they were just beginning to take it out of the oven. So she put us in the car and drove us down there at 4 o'clock in the morning. And they let us in the door. They unlocked the door and let us in. And we went back to the big ovens where they were pulling out the bread from the big ovens. And the bread was like big bundles of dough, is what it was like. And they were loaves, actually. But of course, we didn't have sliced bread in that day. And so they were sold as loaves. Well, so these bundles or loaves of bread came out of the oven, and Mrs. Wansley bought some of them just as they came out of the oven. Oh, it smelled heavenly, absolutely heavenly. And then she drove us back home and had us come in and sit around her kitchen table where she had lots of butter and several kinds of jelly and preserves. And we sat there and ate that hot bread that had just come out of those ovens. We thought that was the best thing we had ever eaten. Oh, it was so good. And that had been such fun for us. So that was the highlight of that party, was getting that bread from the bakery and getting to eat it. So that was that party with at Miss Wansley's home. Then another time, she took us to Glenrose, and in Glenrose there was a. It wasn't a park yet. Later, it was made into a park, but there was just an area along the road where there were huge rocks. They were strange looking rocks, and but they were real big, and it was lots of fun to walk around. You could walk from the top of one to the top of another, and it was just a lot of fun to play on them. Well, she took us over there early in the morning and said we were going for a sunrise breakfast. And just as the sun was coming up, Mrs. Wansley started a fire in a little fire. She had built a little campfire on one of those big rocks, and she cooked our breakfast there, our sunrise breakfast on top of those rocks. And we sat there and ate, and oh, that was such fun, and we thought that was the best breakfast we had ever eaten. And then after we filled up on all that, we went across the road to Oakdale, which had the only swimming pool in that whole area. And we just played in that swimming pool afterwards. But the main thing was playing on the rocks before breakfast, and then having that sunrise breakfast cooked for us on top of those big rocks. So Mrs. Wansley was a wonderful entertainer. So those are two parties that I just remember. And my daddy had a Sunday school class of boys. And one of the things that he liked to do was every year have Mother and Lula cook a huge dinner for the boys. And they would come and she would put extra leaves in our dining table and bring in extra chairs to put around. And the boys would all sit around our dining table, and Mother would just serve mounds of food to them. And they would eat as much as they could, and then they would get up and run around the block and come back and eat some more. And I just stood aside and watched. I just wanted to be a part of that so much. And of course they didn't let me. I'm sure I was a pest to them. And I always kept asking to be a part of their activities, and they never let me. And also, my daddy built a clubhouse with them down in our pasture. The pasture, it was Cousin Bell's property, ran back of some, actually lots for the street, back of that a ways, and there was a creek back there. And then big rocks around that creek, and it was a real pretty spot. And my daddy built a clubhouse there with his Sunday school class. And I kept begging them to let me go in their clubhouse, and they wouldn't let me go in. I was not allowed inside. And I kept asking, and they wouldn't let me. they would spend the night there on Friday nights, and then they would come out and cook their breakfast out in front. And they seemed to just be having so much fun, and I was so jealous. I was so jealous that I wasn't a boy, and so jealous that I wasn't as old as they were. And and so finally one day I got to go inside their clubhouse. Somehow, when they weren't there, somehow I managed to get inside and checked it out. And there were bunks built all along the wall, uh, you know, on top of each other, like there would be two or three uh, on one wall. Uh, and anyway, all around the wall there were sets of bunks. And that was about all there was inside. Because, of course, they did their cooking and eating outside. Well, anyway, I got to see it all. And I felt so proud that I got to get in there and see their secret clubhouse. And I never told them that I got in there because I knew they'd be really mad at me. But that was fun. So that was another Sunday school party and Sunday school activity that my daddy did with his class. Now, my mother had the primary children, and her big event was the Easter egg hunt at Easter. And we had such a big yard, bigger than Daddy bought an extra lot back of our regular lot. So we had a large backyard, and by then we had the swings and various animal cages and the playhouse there. And so it was a very exciting place for little children. And so my mother would have the Easter egg hunt there, and she would dye Easter eggs and have a lot of dyed eggs, and she also bought candy eggs. And then also she made cookies, and she had cookie cutters in the shape of rabbits and chickens, little baby chickens. And so she made the cookies in those shapes and served them. And all the young children from the Sunday school, actually all the preschool children in the Sunday school, came to that Easter egg hunt. And oh, they loved it. And they talked about it during the year. That was one of the big events of the year. That and Christmas were the two big things. And they loved that so. And I remember when I kept wanting to help hide the eggs. And I remember when my mother decided that I was old enough that I could help hide the eggs. And I had to hide them in places that would be easy for the little children to find, but yet were partially hidden. And that was so much fun for me, to hide the Easter eggs and then to watch the children hunt for them and put them in their little baskets. Oh gosh, that was fun. And then they just loved my mother's cookies in the shape of the chickens and the rabbits. So that was a big event. So each of the ages in our family, the young children, where Ann was in that age group, had the Easter egg hunt, and Daddy's class had the big dinner and then the clubhouse, and my class had those two big parties at Miss Wansley's and then some other activities I'd forgotten. So we had a lot of fun connected with our church and the church dinners also. And every Saturday night, my daddy announced that we had to study our Sunday school lesson for the next day, so we would be prepared for our class. Mother and Daddy had to be prepared to teach their classes, and Ann and I were supposed to be prepared to go to our classes and know the lesson and be able to talk about it and participate. So Saturday night was devoted to studying the Sunday school lesson for the next day. Nothing else was allowed on Saturday night. On Sunday morning, of course, the focus was on getting ready to go to Sunday school. And we got our 2 Fort Worth papers on Sunday. That was the only time in the week that we could get them. The rest of the time it was just the Cleburne paper, which only had local news in it. So, of course, the Fort Worth papers were very exciting for us. And I remember they had a whole section of colored comics, several pages of colored comics, which I just thought were wonderful. And I was just dying to see them every Sunday. But of course I was not allowed to see them till after church. And my daddy did open the papers, and I saw him looking at the part of it, and I got very jealous that he was able to look at part of the paper, and I wasn't. But then he told me he was looking for the football scores. That was what he looked for first thing in the Sunday paper. And when he would find the football scores, he would read them out to me for, of course, the University of Texas, and then for TCU and SMU because they were close by, and he kept up with them too. So he would read out those football scores to me early Sunday morning. But that was all I got to hear before we went to Sunday school. So football came first, and then Sunday school, and then church services, and finally got to read the funnies after dinner on Sunday, because we ate right after church. And we often had the minister come to Sunday dinner. And if there was a visiting minister, we always had the visiting minister come to eat with us. And of course, the conversation at the dinner table was always about the preacher's sermon. And if my daddy didn't like something in it, he told the minister. He would critique the Sunday sermon during Sunday dinner if the minister was there or if he was not there. And so that was of course very good for me because it helped me understand a little bit of what was said. So those are some of the things that showed how important the church was in our lives. And I'm running out of juice right now, so I'm going to take a short break. You can pause it, Peter, please. Continuing on in the age group of 9 to 10, I can remember just before Christmas, one of those years, my mother had a supper for her family, all the ones who lived in Cleburne, a Christmas supper. And I can remember afterwards, I can just see them all, her sisters and their husbands and her parents, sitting around our living room. And there was a knock on the door. And my daddy went to the door, and of course, it was Santa Claus. Daddy invited him in, and he and Daddy had their little skit together. And then Santa Claus went around the room speaking to each person. And he knew something about each one. And he said something to them to show that he knew them. Like, how are things going with your 2-year-old? And things like that. And, know, people could not figure out who he was. And I just remember it was the most fun to see all these grown-ups in Mother's family trying to figure out who this was and not being able to figure it out. They were so puzzled, and they just kept talking about who in the world would know that. And it was the funniest thing. And he went around the room talking about something personal to each person. And he and Daddy had a little more of their skit, and then he left. Oh, that was such fun. And by then, I knew who it was. Nobody else knew except my parents and me that was Mac Douglas. And Mac, as I've said before, my mother said he was the best Santa Claus she had ever seen. And she used to take me to Fort Worth every Christmas to see the decorations in all the stores. But she said Mac was better than all of those Santa Clauses in Fort Worth. And he had the personality to go with it. He was naturally very gregarious. He just loved people and was real jolly and was always saying something funny and showing how he loved people. Well, the reason he knew all these things about these people is that they all traded at the bank. And he got acquainted with them that way because he was the main cashier at the bank. And so he knew quite a bit about them. In those days, you had to go to the bank every time you needed cash. And it seemed like that people had to go to the bank at least once a week. And they had to go to deposit every check they got and had to go to cash every check they got. And there were so many just things that they had to do at the bank every week. So the cashiers at the bank got to know all the customers real well. And they knew a lot about each one of them, and they could not figure out who he was. They never did. He was that disguised. His wife had disguised his face well enough with actor's makeup, and his costume was just perfect. And they could not figure out who he was. That was the funniest thing. We laughed afterwards, my parents and I, after it was all over. We just thought that was the funniest thing we'd ever seen. And we loved it. Because they never did know it was Mac. And of course he loved it. He loved it. Oh, that was great. Now, one thing that happened Christmas I should have thought to mention earlier because it happened every Christmas. My parents always fixed some big boxes of things for a poor family. And they would get the name of some poor family and find out what they needed. And then they would fill boxes with all kinds of food, and they would put in other things that they needed, like blankets. I remember boxes with canned goods, and on top of them would be blankets that the people needed. And whatever we found out they needed. And then for the children, there were always some toys. And I can remember getting to go with my parents to take those boxes and see, particularly the little children, how excited they were. And we were so thankful that we were able to help that family. And every Christmas, this was done for some family. And it meant so much to us. So, so I just wanted to mention that. Then back to the ages 9 to 12, or 10 rather. Um, I can remember that I had really wanted to go camping because the boys in our neighborhood would talk about going camping. And I wanted so much to be a boy and get to go camping with them. And I kept begging my daddy to let me go camping. And he would say, "Well, I'll take you camping sometime." Well, he would plan to do it and then it wouldn't work out for some reason. So what he finally did was set up a tent in our backyard for me. And he put a cot in it. And I spent the night out there in that cot for many nights. And afterwards, after that, in the morning, Daddy would come out there and he fixed a little fireplace on the grass. And he would cook my breakfast in a little skillet out there on the fire. So I could feel like I was camping. That was so good of him, and I just loved it. Really loved it. Also, he let me play with his guns. He had brought back from World War I, when he was discharged from the army at the end of the war, they gave each soldier a gun to take with them. And I don't know whether it was a gun they had used in battle or what, but anyway, they each got a rifle to take and a helmet and a trunk full for their clothes. And the trunk that he brought, at that time, my father showed me that trunk, and I had read about people restoring old trunks and how rewarding that was. So I decided I wanted to restore that trunk. It had some kind of fabric, like a canvas or something, glued to the outside. And most of that had come off, but there were pieces of it stuck all around on the outside. And the inside looked terrible. Well, Peter helped me much, much later, when I was much older. Peter helped me to get that old stuck canvas off the outside of that trunk. And I restored the outside and the inside. I ordered new hinges because these were broken or something. And I found a place where you could order hardware from old trunks, and I ordered those hinges, and I restored the inside and the outside. Now, I've gotten off on a tangent talking about that trunk, and that happened many years later, long after the period I'm talking about. What I had started to talk about was, at the same time that he gave me the trunk, he let me play with the rifle that they gave him when he was discharged and the helmet that, like those that was worn in the battle. And all of the fellas in his barrack had signed on the helmet, but he just did not feel any emotional attachment to it. I think he was so relieved that the war was over that he just didn't feel an emotional attachment to that helmet or to the rifle. So he let me play with both of them. And I loved that rifle. And then he had a double barrel shotgun that he used to go bird hunting years earlier, and that was what he had used for it for. So those two big rifles were not, he was not using them anymore, but I loved playing with them. And I'd put on that helmet and take those guns, and oh, I just really enjoyed it. And I would get in that tent that he had fixed for me in the yard and get in there with my guns, and oh, that was hot stuff for me. I just loved it. And I felt like I was being like a boy, like I wanted to be when I played with those guns. Now, I remember other little incidents with the boys in our neighborhood. For instance, one time, John Fuston, who lived 2 doors down from us, broke his arm. He was showing off and jumping off of something and broke his arm. And his mother was just frantic, and she came running up to my mother and bringing John Fuston and asking my mother if she would take them to the hospital because they didn't have a car. So mother drove him to the hospital and took me too. And I just remember how John Fuston was just screaming all the way. And we got in there, and I can remember sitting in there with him when he got an x-ray, and then when the doctor was setting his arm. And I was right there beside him when they were setting it and trying to help him be brave about it. And he was crying and crying, and I'm sure it hurt a lot. And his mother and my mother were both standing there trying to do what they could to help, but there really wasn't anything they could do. But it was finally got set and cast put on it, and we took him back home. Then I remember another boy that lived further down the street. One day, he came up to our block with a monkey. Someone had given him a little monkey, and I just thought that was the cutest thing. I was thrilled with that little monkey, and I wanted to hold him. And he said, no, I couldn't hold him. But I got so close, and I was touching the monkey, trying to pat him on the back. And he leaned over and bit me on the ear. And he bit so hard that my ear just started gushing blood. And of course I cried and went into my mother, and she rushed me down to Dr. Lee's. And of course he sewed up my ear and had Miss Ewald give me a shot. But I didn't want to have anything more to do with monkeys. And that boy did not get to keep that monkey very often. He's very long. His parents made him give it up after that. So those were a couple of things I remember about the boys in the neighborhood. And they were just so much a part of my life. But I also remember my new girlfriend, Ruth, who then moved into the neighborhood. And I was so happy to have a girl there. And I can remember that Ruth and I played paper dolls in our living room. And I had gotten a book of adult paper dolls and had cut them out. And Ruth and I made up stories about those paper dolls and played with them. And she always had her girl be Joan Crawford, because Joan Crawford was her ideal movie star. And I thought Joan Crawford was too risque. So I chose Janet Gaynor as my paper doll girl. Janet Gaynor. So I named her that, and because I thought she was much more modest and behaved better. But then we would get down on the floor in our living room and build houses for our paper dolls using the books in the bookshelves. We would take the books down and set them around to divide rooms with books, and even use the books like for a bed. And so we had almost all the books out of the bookshelf, and had each of us had a different corner in the room where we had our paper doll houses set up. My mother was so good to let us do that. You couldn't hardly walk in the living room because we had these paper doll houses spread all over the living room. She let us do it. She said the only thing was we had to have it cleaned up before my daddy got home from work. So we would do it all during the day, but boy, we sure got it up before Daddy came home. So he would have a nice, calm living room to come in and sit in when he got home from work. So I remember that so well with Ruth, and that was the fun that we had together. And that was when I was about 10 years old. I don't think that I played paper dolls after that. But I remember when Ann had a birthday party, and I'm not sure how old she was, but it was maybe around that time. And it was when the Dion quintuplets were popular. And I got paper doll books of the Dion quintuplets. And I asked my mother to let me have the entertainment at Ann's birthday party. And Mother let me just be in charge of the whole thing. And there were about 10 little girls there. And I gave each one of them one of these paper doll books. And I don't remember what we did with them, but I just know that I was in charge of all the entertainment, and we had those paper doll books, and then we played little games. And oh, I thought I was such a good party giver. And I don't know how Ann felt about it. She put up with it anyway. So, so I enjoyed that. I had just so many good, happy experiences. And right now I can't think of anything else in that age group. But then I remember at ages 11 to 12, a lot of things were happening. And 12 was when, let's see, Ann was 7, and that was when Ann's baby horse was born, her little colt. So before that happened, my daddy built a barn for the horses because he knew he needed something for the little baby colt. And some earlier, several months before the colt was born, he got a box car, bought an old box car, and had it delivered into our pasture near the end where there was, where it would be easy to put a water line. And then he designed a way to make that boxcar into a barn for our horses, for my horse and Ann's horse and the colt. And it was so clever. And every afternoon after school, it seemed that he would come home and go down to work on the barn, and he would take me with him and let me help him. And I loved helping to build that barn. And it was so clever. What he did was, in about over half of the barn, maybe like 2/3 of it, maybe almost 3/4, he took off one side and part of the roof, a little bit of the roof of the boxcar. And that was the open part of the barn. And then the rest of it was used for an enclosed room for our feed. We kept the feed and kept our saddles and bridles, our tack. And it was just the most convenient thing. And for the inside of that open barn, he built a walkway from the feed room out over the end of the open barn and down to some racks where you could put the hay. We could walk on that walkway, which was up off of the ground a few feet, walk from the room with the feed and carry it, the bales of hay and all, and break it up and put it in this rack down at the other end of the barn. And that was the neatest thing. And then there was plenty of room in that open part of the barn for the horses to get in there to eat and it to be in there in bad weather. And the north side was covered. So the only thing that was exposed was the south side. And so they were protected mainly that way. And then he had a water line run from the nearest water, which was at the home of the Altenreiths, which they were a older couple that Mr. Altenreith cut grass for people, and so he helped water our horses, seeing that they had enough water and so forth. And so the line was run from his yard over near the barn, and Daddy put a tank there to fill with water, and then he built a fence across a part of that area, and that became the lot next to the barn, the lot where we put the horses when we wanted to keep them up. So we had a lot with a tank of water in it, and right up as a part of it at one end was the barn. And so you could enter the lot just this side, just the south side of the feed room, or you could enter it from the inside of the feed room. Or, I mean, next to the feed room from the inside. I can't describe it very well, but it was the neatest arrangement. And it just fit our horses just ideal. And so Ann's little colt was born when she was in the first grade. She was 7 years old. And the morning it was, Daddy came in that morning to tell us, while we were getting ready for school, to tell us that Ann's colt had been born. And of course she wanted to go see it immediately, and I did too. So he took us down to see it. And Ann didn't want to leave it. She wanted to stay with her baby horse. And my parents let her. I thought that was so neat that they let her stay there all day with that baby horse. And my mother called Ann's teacher, Miss Mattie Haynes, who had also taught me. And she said that Ann's baby horse had come and she wanted to stay with it. And Miss Haynes said, well, that's fine. And she said, can I bring the whole class down to see the horse? And so she asked directions. And it was about 4 blocks down, I guess, from the school. Long blocks, maybe 5. And Miss Mattie Haynes, and she got some other helpers to walk with her, and she walked the whole class back to our barn so they could see Ann's little horse. I'm starting to cry. That was just the most wonderful thing. I had to go on to school. But of course I went back there as soon as I got home from school. But I thought it was wonderful that my parents let Ann stay there all day and that Miss Haynes brought the whole class down to see the horse. And she recognized the importance of Ann staying there all day. Now, Bob, who had taught Ann and I uh, most of what we knew about riding horses, although Ann had learned a lot at the Prude Ranch. Uh, but Bob still helped us with our horses, and he had been there when the colt was born, and he was helping with it that day. I think it was Bob. I know it was somebody. And so it was just a wonderful experience for our whole family, for that little colt to be born and her whole class. And I get emotional just thinking about it. And so, of course, Ann wanted to go there even more often after that, every day down there. And I, after school, and I always wanted to go down after school to see my horse and to ride him. And when I got my bicycle, I was able to ride down there by myself. And I would ride down there and just stay with my horse. I just loved just being with him. And I remember around that time, the Tom Mix show came to Cleveland. Tom Mix was very popular in those days. He was in cowboy movies, and I guess he came before Roy Rogers and the other cowboy. I can't think of his name. It was so popular. Anyway, so Tom Mix, I guess, came first. And he had his own circus after he was in the movies. And so they rented this lot that Daddy was managing down at the end of the street. So we got passes to the grounds. And I remember my friends, two of my friends and I went down there, and we were so eager to see Tom Mix. We were such fans of his. And we found out where he was. He had a van that was something like the big buses that singers travel around in today. It looked something like that, but what didn't have near the conveniences, I'm sure. But anyway, he had that big van, and they put a partial tent over it to make it cooler. And so we were just dying to see him. And we asked where he was and when we could see him. And one of the circus hands told us that he was in his van and he wouldn't come out till he went to lunch. But he would have to come out to go down to the cook tent to eat his lunch. And so we stood there by his van, and they had a wire around that van and that tent-like thing over it a wire out a ways from it, so we couldn't get right up next to it. But we stood there as close as we could, waiting and waiting for Tom Mix to come out so we could see him. Well, finally he did come out, and he completely ignored us. He walked right past us, didn't even look at us. And of course, we were so disappointed, but at least we got to see him. And we followed him as he walked down to the food tent, the cook tent. Can you imagine how he must have felt? But I guess he was used to that. But we followed him all the way down there, and then they didn't let us in the cook tent where the circus people had their meals. But one of the men that took care of his horse was named Tony. The man who took care of him asked my daddy if they could put him out in our pasture. And Daddy said sure. And so Tom Mix's horse was out in our pasture. They had a rope on him so he couldn't go very far. But he was in the pasture, and of course he was able to eat grass and all and walk around a little bit. Oh, I was so excited that his horse was there, and I just loved seeing that horse. And then we saw the show, and we were thrilled with the show. He put on a really good show and did all kinds of tricks on his horse, and then he did tricks with a gun too. He did a lot of shooting acts. And so we just thought he was wonderful, and we were big Tom Mix fans. So that was when I was about 10 years old. So I'm trying to think now what was next. Oh yeah. I wanted to go up into ages 11 and 12 now, and I remember that when I was 11, Dr. Arnold, our minister, had lost his wife years ago and had remarried a woman that we knew, Miss Clem, and she taught expression in Cleveland. She taught me expression, and I loved Miss Clem. And she had a sister who had 3 children, and Miss Clem never had any children, but her sister had these 3 and had 2 girls around the ages of Ann and I, and then a little boy. And so she wanted to entertain her sister's children and invited them to come to visit them for a week. And while they were planning what to do, Dr. Arnold came to my daddy and said they wanted to do something real special for those children when they were there. And Daddy suggested that they rent Camp Tres Rios for a few days, and their family and that family go over to Camp Tres Rios together. So Dr. Arnold loved that idea, and that's what they did. And Mother and Miss Clem cooked up a lot of food to take, but they also took groceries that they could cook things in the camp kitchen. And we had the whole camp to ourselves, the swimming pool and everything. We stayed upstairs in the main lodge where it was broken up into different rooms. That's where the counselors stayed during camp. And so we were there for 3 or 4 days, and we just had a wonderful time having a swimming pool to ourselves, and we were able to use all the athletic equipment and everything, and it was just great. And I can remember us going on a hike along the Brazos River and having a cookout, and Dr. Arnold took the lead in the cookout, and he had such a good time doing that. And that was just the most wonderful experience for our family and for those children of her sisters. And her sister was named Vesta. And the next year, when I was 12 years old, was the Texas Centennial. And that was a big deal in Texas. It was 100 years old, and the state built a number of historic monuments around the state, and most of all, they took the Dallas Fair and converted it into a state fair. They built this huge hall of state with statues of all the Texas heroes, early Texas heroes, and several buildings. And that became the Dallas Fair then, which was open every year after that for 2 or 3 weeks. So for the centennial at the fair, Vesta, Miss Clem's sister Vesta, invited our family to come and stay with them. They had moved to Dallas, and she wanted us to come stay with them in Dallas and go to the fair, the Centennial Fair. And that's what we did. And I remember the 2 things that I remember about it are the Hall of State with all the big heroes that I had heard about, and then something that didn't seem to fit at all but was wonderful. There was an exhibit by Admiral Byrd from the North Pole, and he had come there. He was going around to different fairs and putting on this exhibit, and he had his sled there, and packed like they had it packed when they discovered the North Pole or whatever it was they did. And they had statues of penguins standing around, and I don't remember what else it was. The big sled was the main thing I remember. But oh, I loved that Admiral Byrd exhibit. And I loved hearing about the North Pole. So that was the main thing I remember from going to the state fair that centennial year. Now, I remember 2 other things that the state did that were very important that year. One, they built a monument in the Acton Cemetery near where Grandmother Davis lived, and where so many of my relatives are buried. They built a monument there to Davy Crockett's wife because she was buried there. That she was related to us. And they built his monument, and we were so proud to have it. And it said on it that it belonged to the state of Texas, and this was a Texas hero and all that, and it was just wonderful. So I remember that one. And the other special thing they did that I remember was to restore the old fort where Cynthia Ann Parker's family had lived when she was abducted by the Comanches. And that was down near Mahia. And Grandmother Abbas wanted to see that because she had heard all her life, or ever since she married into the Kilo family, I should say, she had heard that Cynthia Ann Parker was her relative. And so she, and that family was related to us. And she wanted to see that fort where it had happened. And so my daddy drove her down there and took me too. And I can just remember walking around the outside of that fort and then on the inside with Grandmother. She was beginning to get feeble, and it was hard for her to walk, but she was determined. She was so interested in that, and it was fascinating to see what the real fort looked like. So it's still pretty clear in my mind. So those were two special things for the centennial that I remember. And so I was 12 years old in 1936 when this happened. And I've run out of juice now. I'm going to take a little break. Peter? I remember now something I want to add. This had actually happened when I was 10, and I forgot to tell it then when I was talking about that age group. But when I was 10 and was at camp, all was well and I loved being at camp. But then we had a talk that night by a visiting nurse. Occasionally they had a speaker at night instead of our usual program. And they were always very helpful and informative. But this nurse did not realize that there were a few young girls in that camp from very conservative communities who would not be familiar with some of the things she was talking about. And I can remember sitting there listening as she talked about female health. Well, my mother had not even told me about girls having menstruation. I didn't know anything that made girls different from boys, except we didn't have a penis. But I didn't know anything else that was different about girls. And I didn't know anything about having babies. Well, this nurse went on to talk about all of those things about girls and feminine health, taking care of yourself, and then how to avoid getting pregnant and what to do if you got pregnant. Oh my gosh. I was so upset I didn't know what to do. It scared me. I hadn't heard any of those things. And I didn't know what was going on. And I was scared. And I remember going back to my cabin, and I know 3 of my friends were at camp, but they had each of us in a different cabin. And I remember going back to my cabin, and I hadn't had a chance to get very well acquainted yet with the other campers or the counselor. But I went in and there was nobody there yet, and I remember sitting on my bed and just crying because I felt so lost and thought, what is going on that I don't know about? And what's going to happen to me? And then, after I'd been sitting there crying for a little while, I heard somebody call my name at the door. And I went out, and it was Lucy Lee. She was a junior counselor. And she took me over to a real quiet, private spot, and we sat down on a little log bench under a tree. And she said that she realized that that nurse talked about things that I had never heard before. that my mother had not yet had a chance to tell me, and that she was sure my mother planned to tell me before long. But since I was so upset about what this woman had said, Lucy Lee went on and explained to me all the things about female anatomy and female problems and what happened, which meant that we could have children. What about our makeup was that so that we could have babies, and what caused that to happen, and just everything about it. And she did it in such a way that it was so easy for me to follow and to understand. It was just the most wonderful experience for Lucy Lee explaining all that, like people might call about the birds and the bees, but it was so much more than that. It was just everything about being a girl, it seemed, that she explained to me. And I was so grateful to her, and I sat there crying, and she hugged me, and oh, it was such a wonderful experience. And I would be grateful to Lucy Lee for the rest of her life for that. That was such a wonderful experience. And she said, now, I know when you get home, your mother plans to tell you these things, and you can tell her what happened and tell her what I told you, and then you can see what she wants to add to it. But she kept bringing my mother into it and didn't want to leave her out. Oh, she was masterful the way she handled it. And I felt fine then. I was proud to be a girl, and I felt thankful about my life. And it just, oh, I just keep crying thinking about it. She turned a very scary, upsetting experience for me into a very beautiful experience, which enabled me to help start growing up. And I never forgot. And when I got home, I did tell my mother about it and told her everything Lucy Lee said. When my mother and I had a private talk, we had it in the bathroom, and she would have me sitting on the stool in the bathroom. And I don't remember what she sat on, but I can remember sitting on that stool and talking to her about such private things. So I told her all about what Lucy Lee had said, and she felt very grateful to Lucy Lee for explaining it all. And she just added to it a little bit, and everything was fine then after that. The rest of my camp experience was all just great. And my experience with Lucy Lee was just wonderful after that. I felt a special tie to her after that. So that's what I wanted to tell tonight. And I think I'll close this part of my story with that. I just can't tell anything else after that. that was so emotional and meant so much to me. Nothing else could be near it. So that night, I started growing up.